Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today to discuss the fundamentals of building sales excellence. My name is Dave Zilberman. I'm a general partner at Norwest Venture Partners, which is a venture capital and growth equity fund with $9.5 billion under management and a foundational focus on enterprise. Today's session is an example of the best practices and knowledge sharing that our investors and the Norwest Portfolio Services team provide to our portfolio companies. We offer the advisory services and connected network of experts and resources our companies require to help them scale their businesses. I'm really excited and grateful to Neil Hudspeth to join us today to share his wisdom and experience running some of the most complex yet effective sales organizations. I had the honor of observing Neil's mastery of all things field operations while an investor and board observer at DocuSign, where Neil served as president of worldwide field operations. Neil's DocuSign experience is particularly relevant and unique as DocuSign in parallel sells to SMB, mid-market, and enterprise customers. Prior to DocuSign, Neil was senior vice president of human capital management for Oracle, where he led sales and cloud professional services for PeopleSoft, JD Edwards, Taleo, and Fusion HCM. As EVP of Worldwide Field Operations and Chief Customer Officer at Taleo, he helped accelerate growth and create a market leader in talent management. Okay, so let's get the party going. Neil, welcome. How are you today?
I'm great, Dave. Good to see you. Thanks for inviting me.
It's a pleasure to be here. We appreciate your time.
Cool. I was just thinking, actually, as you went through a couple of roles, I remember when I retired from DocuSign about 18 months ago from operating, I wrote in my retirement mail to the company that I'd presided over 160 quarters in my career. So I don't know if I've got a ton of wisdom, but I've definitely got a few experiences to share. And then I was thinking, and I don't know if you've heard this one before, my first job out of college, other than working on a construction site, was selling for Rank Xerox. So I used to sell photocopiers. And the premise was, if you were selling photocopiers, people needed to copy a lot of paper. So we cut down a lot of trees. You wind that forward 40 years, and the last role I had as an operator was actually saving trees at DocuSign and trying to get rid of paper. So yeah, in that time, hopefully there's a few experiences that we can share today that might be of interest to the portfolio.
Well, Neil, it speaks to the creativity and the adaptability necessary to be an effective sales leader, which you unquestionably were.
Bless you.
So I'll be playing the role of MC. I'll be asking Neil questions, but if there are questions from the audience, please send them to me directly in the Zoom Q&A feature, which is at the very bottom of your Zoom screen. A number of questions were submitted already. I'll add them directly into the conversation, but if there are any other questions, please don't hesitate to put them into the Q&A section. So as backdrop to this conversation, effective sales and go-to-market have always been critical. There's no denying that. But as we find ourselves in a hyper-competitive environment, spurred by unprecedented venture investments by my compatriots, the adage of distribution trumps product has never been more relevant. And for context, that unprecedented venture activity was a quarterly record of $125 billion invested in Q1 2021, which, by the way, is a 94% year-over-year increase. And Q1 of 20 was not COVID. Only the last couple of weeks were. So it was not a slow quarter by any means. And so for purposes of this conversation, we will approach it through 6 tactical sections to talk about the sales leadership journey. We'll touch on the why, the when, the who, the how, the setup for success, and we'll round it out with evaluating sales leadership. Okay, so that's the journey we're on. We have a lot of ground to cover and about 40 minutes. So let's start with the why. So this may seem to be obvious and elementary, but let's set the foundation and set expectations. Neil, why should entrepreneurs hire sales leaders?
I've heard that question a few times in the advisory work I've been lucky enough to do over the last 18 months. I think as soon as we see an interest in a product and we've got customers using that product, that generally is driven by founders, and that's great because we begin to see value. But I think the most important thing early on, or the next stage, is to amplify voice. And I think when we want to move from 3 to more or to many, starting to think about a go-to-market strategy or getting a salesperson on board becomes paramount. It's probably one of the easiest ways, customer-wise, to amplify voice.
Yeah, agreed. And so you touched on exactly the point, Neil, of at what juncture do you hire a sales executive? So let's move to the more substantive, meaty parts of the discussion, the when. When should entrepreneurs hire a sales executive?
Number of thoughts on that question. I think if the founder has the bandwidth, and I've seen it work quite well, and we'll take it just in a couple of stages. The founder, if has the bandwidth, can actually manage 2 to 3 salespeople, likely, on top of all the other responsibilities. And I think bringing in sales execs that have experience in startup, not necessarily domain, but in startup selling, which by definition is somewhat more scrappy than when you scale. I think the founder can bring on sales executives, 2 or 3, and can probably manage them. I think when you start scaling beyond 3, and you start looking at 3 to 10, 3 to 12, you start needing to look at a sales manager that can manage a sales motion. So I think, to me, they are 2 stages to consider. Founder manage, a couple of sales reps with proven startup credentials. Starting getting a little bit bigger, you need to start thinking about a sales manager coming on board.
And what do you think about the initial sales, closing those initial sales? And do you need those junior sales managers on board? Do you need to close 3, 5 accounts, get any level of revenue traction before it makes sense to bring on that experience?
You know, it's interesting with the PLG models, rightly people are talking where the product does sell itself if it's the right product. Interestingly, I think revenue in the beginning needs to be somewhat secondary, which is a strange thing for me to say as I've led revenue teams for my career. But I think in some models, the salespeople coming on are more valuable getting the voice of the customer on the validity of the product or what's needed, as opposed to being a communication vehicle back into the company, as opposed to revenue. I mean, it's a really interesting balance. I mean, we obviously want both, but if we're amplifying voice, we're finding out more of what the customer thinks of us, which enables us to meet more needs of the customer, which leads to revenue. Now, the question I would ask to the answer that I gave is, okay, but when does revenue happen? I mean, we would all like to balance both, but I do think the voice of the customer is as important initially as a revenue stream.
So to that point, I guess, voice of the customer, how do you think about marketing? And when should an organization bring on marketing executives relative to sales leadership? Should one come before the other, or should they happen in tandem?
Again, I think when we're starting up, we don't have a massive pot of funds to bring in multiple executives. And then you have the discussion internally, can you have a sales leader that's also a marketing leader? I mean, possibly you can. One of the interesting metrics, I think, today is so much of a buyer's journey is achieved long before they have a contact with the company. So that, that do the research. In the old days, you always needed a rep to tell everything that was happening in the company, in the product. You needed sales engineers, you need four-legged calls, you needed somebody on the phone, you needed a bunch of demos. Now, when a buyer speaks to a company, he's probably 80% aware of what they do, how they do it, and is probably trying to make a decision against a competitor. And so marketing, without doubt, is needed to make sure that websites are informative, you can find information easily, you can market stroke sell your technology and the value. I do think initially, though, sales first is more pragmatic, because before you do all of that, you've got to have the knowledge that you get from the customer. And I think the way you do that is bringing on salespeople first, just a couple, before you make an investment in a marketing executive. Just an opinion of one.
Great perspective. Great perspective. What about the COO or the CRO owning all of go-to-market? Do you think that there should be a division of labor, division of responsibilities? Do you think that's a different skill set, that's a different individual in an organization?
I think in the beginning, you might have to have somebody that appears to own all of go-to-market, which would include marketing and customer support, customer success, and that's going to be economies of scale. I think there's another point where you want to bring in specialization, where you want the CEO to spend quality time with marketing and the data, and you want quality time with customer success because you want to hear the voice of the customer directly. I think then you go through another maturation as the company then expands and scales. Looking at senior executives that you might want to bring in at that time, they are more likely to have managed most of, if not all, of go-to-market. So I think there's just different points in the journey. Some are financial, some became complete domain expertise because you need to be excellent at everything. And you'll generally have a CRO that's biased towards, say, revenue, doesn't care so much about marketing, it doesn't help. Biased towards revenue, doesn't care so much about customer success, it doesn't help. But I think in time, when you look at an E-staff in a scaled environment, you might want to consolidate some of those roles under that executive.
Got it. Got it. So perfect segue onto the who. So as we think about who the sales leader should be, how do you think about what are some of the key characteristics that person should embody? And I say this from the perspective of, you have hired many sales leaders. You yourself have been hired as a sales leader. And so you have very tangible perspective from both dimensions.
Yeah, a couple of qualities. I mean, for me, probably the most important, if I look back and observe others, is collaboration, both internally and externally. It's so important today that the sales leader is aware of a new product release, and we have 4 iterations per year as product management. It's as important today for a sales leader to understand good and bad business through the eyes of finance. It's as important for a sales leader to work hand in hand with HR to make sure we're recruiting the right people, we're helping develop the right culture, the right spirit. So I think collaboration for me is one of the absolute key traits in any executive, actually. And I've got other views on that when it comes to forecasting, the company's health as well. Another one for me is just, and it has to be the maniacal focus on the number. And there's 100 ways of getting there now. There's a huge amount of data, but that is something that I think a sales leader needs to love. Data is so important, and we all know it, and we all talk about it. But when you really bring it alive, I know myself, when I started at DocuSign, we were about 100 people, and we were about 20 million in revenue, 150 people, 20 million in revenue. And, we had some data, but it was very different to when I retired and we were $1 billion in revenue, and we were 4,500 people. But over the years, and it's not a quick fix, the data enabled the company to think very differently about the future. So I'll give an example about forecast data. When you're in a quarter, all you can do is execute. But the big thing for me was, could I reliably forecast 1 quarter out, then 2 quarters out, then 3 quarters out? And if you're using the data in the right way, you can. We actually got to a situation as we were leading up to going public, and then were public for the first year, that we could look a year out in our business and have a variable of 5 to 6%, 4 quarters out. So I want to see a sales leader that truly loves and understands how to utilize the data. Another example would be win rates. So our win rate in commercial was 36%, which was actually very good. Most people, when you say that number to, oh my God, so, you know, you've lost whatever it was, 64%. And, you know, reality is you're not necessarily losing that. You know, people are pending decisions. It just hasn't closed within that period. And there's multiple reasons why. Some will, of course, be lost. But if you worked on just increasing that win percentage from 36 to 37%, and actually understood the levers you could pull to do that, the difference that would make in your bookings and revenue is phenomenal. And if you do that on a regular basis, that data really means something, as opposed to talking about, well, we need data. So for me, and a sales leader, definitely collaboration, maniacal focus on the number. You have to. Nobody should ever accept missing a quarter, ever. And I have missed them. And then loving data.
Interesting. And we'll get on to setting up for success, where some of the points you touched on are particularly relevant. But in the context of the who, and you touched on this earlier, Neil, but how do you think about domain experience versus sales leadership? You know, one example I'll use, in cybersecurity is a category that is still growing very, very quickly. There's a huge need for leadership in cybersecurity companies, but there weren't as many potential candidates in cybersecurity. How do you think about the difference between domain experience versus sales leadership experience? Which one is more important to you?
Yeah, I think in an ideal world, we would like both. But if I think of more of a startup mentality, and I think of what is the art of the possible. So if there's a cybersecurity company, to use your example, and there's, say, $50 million in revenue, and then I'm starting up and I've got my first 20 customers, I have some revenue, whatever that might be, and I really want domain experience. I go into that company at 50 million and I want their sales leader. The chance of me getting that person, I think, are possible, but I think on occasion as opposed to always. And so whilst I would love it, I would look at the art of the possible, and I believe I can go out and get a great startup sales leader in SaaS. If the company is the company I think it is the startup, they can get that individual on board to understand, probably not having a playbook, but understand the strategy and the positioning. And I think a lot of good sales leaders are quick learners, and that's something to test in the interview process. So if you have that, I think you can get up and running in a pretty short period of time with your hiring process. If you go for domain, it's a maybe.
Got it. And that presumably changes as the organization becomes bigger, more established, more brand recognition, and perhaps at that point you could go after that sales leader that's working at a competitor or adjacent business with considerable scale.
Yeah, no doubt. I think scale and different points on the journey allow you to do different things, and you don't even realize you're doing different things because you're living it every day. But you know, sometimes when you sit back, and I know I've done it a few times, and just the quality of executive you can bring on at certain times compared to when you begin, it's just a marked difference.
Yeah. So here's a question from the audience, which is, what are 3 things to avoid or red flags when hiring a sales leader?
I think one of them is, you know, have a good look at that LinkedIn profile or resume, whatever's delivered to you. If you see somebody that's hopping around company after company, I can take somebody giving me an explanation that that company just didn't go anywhere. But when I've heard that 14 times, from a candidate, you probably have a red flag there. I think in sales management, because many sales leaders feel under pressure all of the time, another thing to guard against, and maybe you get this through referencing, is you really do want somebody that is more of a coach, not a bully. So bullying techniques, not being able to retain their sales team, that's something to look out for, because that also leads to a lack of collaboration. And I said earlier, I think that's one of the most important traits for any executive, not just a sales executive. Somebody that's too good to be true, that always shines through. You know, I've never seen a resume for a salesperson where they didn't make every President's Club, did over 100%. And, you know, life tells you that, and experience tells you that might not be the case. The other one, I think, for me, and this is a general point, and sales do it sometimes more than others, only talks about success. You generally find that person isn't well-rounded. I think anybody that's willing to be a little bit broader is a better bet than somebody that only wants to talk about how good they are. And the me is a bit of a sales trait. It's not very nice. You know, it's great when people talk about the team that were with me, product, sales engineers, enabled us to do X, as opposed to I did X. And so the me syndrome, I think, is something to look out for as well.
Yeah, got it. Sorry, one other, actually, we have a number of questions popping in here. Question from the audience is it fair to expect that a sales leader have existing relationships and a Rolodex when coming from a similar organization? Is that an expectation? Is that something that you would require of them?
If it was domain expertise, I think that would be a big plus. You know, you have to be a little bit careful, because bringing over your portfolio, it's not like wealth management where they seem to move from one firm to another and 100 clients go with them. I think one has to be careful of that. I think the Rolodex, it's funny actually, that word I still use, and I do get laughed at.
I don't actually have a Rolodex anymore.
I get laughed at by my son, who's in sales at DocuSign, and my son-in-law, who's at sales in DocuSign, who says nepotism is dead. I don't know what you would call it otherwise. But yeah, I think it's fair if you've got somebody with domain expertise, I would like them to have a Rolodex of partners, so people they've worked with that have helped broaden the solution. I think that's important. And I would like them, obviously, to have relationships with the customers that they serve. So I think it's fair to assume if it's domain, you would benefit from that.
Yeah, got it. Makes sense. So let's move a little bit to this particular area, which I actually think is one of the toughest, which is the how. And this is a problem I see very often. And I see this especially challenging in situations where it's a highly technical team that may not have managed sales folks in the past. And so interviewing and evaluating salespeople is tricky. Salespeople are really good at selling their product or themselves. And so to cut through the storytelling I find it to be very challenging as well. So as you have embarked on that, Neil, what are some of the best practices? What are some suggestions you have for interviewing a head of sales or sales folks in general?
When I look at interviewing generally, I think it has changed over the years. There was a real belief that you get the best out of people when they feel very comfortable in front of you. And you can ask them questions and they feel a level of comfort and they can open up. There's so many different tactics. I actually don't disagree with that. That's a point of view. But I actually like to be a little bit unconventional when I interview salespeople. And one of the first questions I started to ask, particularly in the world of SaaS, whereas I think we all agree the buyer has so much more knowledge than they had prior to SaaS about the product. One of the first questions that I ask is, just give me your elevator pitch at your current company. And a good salesperson, will not miss a beat and say, our role is to do this or our solution does that. And it will take a minute. A salesperson that might be able to sell themselves, but actually is a little bit less prepared or maybe a little bit hollow, will really struggle with that question. And I think you learn a lot because we love our product. We know our product's going to be successful. We know we've only just begun, but we want somebody that can articulate that vision as well as the founder, give or take. Yeah. So that's a slightly more unconventional start with a salesperson or a sales manager. The other group of questions that I'm always interested in is, tell me about your teams. How have they done? What's the productivity of the team? Where have your team gone on when they've left you to? What has been the biggest success you've had with team members and how they've built their career after spending time with yourself? So that's definitely not unconventional, but I want in my company to create a culture where people get value from working there and working for leaders that can coach them to the next steps in their career. And it might be moving up from SMB to mid to majors, but I still want to know that. So there's just a couple of questions that mean a lot to me when I'm interviewing a salesman or a sales leader. And I think both are applicable. There's obviously many more. I think the internet is awash with, here are the 9 best questions to ask. And I think they're all good. But I think being a bit more unconventional to draw out the candidate has benefited me on more than one occasion.
Yeah. And as far as interviewing candidates, how many would you suggest should be interviewed? And I'll tap into my 17th century French literature, Voltaire, and perfect being the enemy of good. This could be ongoing, interview process. At what point do you say, I found someone and their person is good enough, we think?
Yeah, I think, again, it's a bit of a variable, but I think if you're looking for salespeople or sales leaders, the one thing I'd probably stay away from initially, and this is more of a financial comment, which wasn't your question, I would stay away from recruiters. You're just another number. We love our company. We believe in our product. I know everybody has salespeople, but our company's different. Everybody has babies, but your baby is different. It's your baby. And I would stay away from recruiters because I think the money is better spent elsewhere. So through your own contacts, through your own contacts, frankly, and there's many ways that you can initiate getting recommendations. I would bring in 3, 4 people that are recommended to me by my network, and I would interview 3 or 4 people for a role. I think as time goes on, you have to be a bit more sophisticated because you're hiring 10s and 20s at a time, and so you need recruiters. I'm not knocking recruiters. I just think in the beginning, getting leads from your network, people you trust, and getting a docket of 3 or 4 people for a role, if you're lucky enough to do so. And I don't think the process should take 3 months. I think if you were looking for a CRO and you're a $100 million company, you're going to have a different point of view and you'll get advice from Heidrick. But initially 3 or 4 for a role. And I think you should move pretty quickly because you need, and you also know your company better than anybody and your product better than anybody. And you can size that up, I think, because perfect isn't going to happen. Good absolutely can.
Yeah. How about references, right? So we all ideally strive for blind references. Sometimes you could find them, you ask candidates for references, and of course, they'll only present those that will speak highly of them. How do you think about references? Do you do references? How deep do you go on references? How much time do you spend with references?
A lot. You can never do enough. Geez, we're lazy. And general comment, we found somebody, we like him or her, and off we go. We got to fill because we've got to get the product out. We've got to finish the website. We've got to complete that deal. We've got to work with venture capitalists to get a little bit more money. Let's hire that person because I really like them. And that, of course, works on occasion. What I've learned is when I've been lazy, I've been 50-50 on what's come through the door. When I have over-referenced in some people's minds, I've had a much better outcome. If you're going to do 3 references, do 4. it's a bit like a salesperson on a Friday. The most successful salesperson is the person that makes the last call when everybody's gone for a beer. It's true. If you're going to do 3 references, do 4. It will help.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So, so we've covered the why, we've covered when, we've covered who. Now let's talk about, we've covered the how. Let's talk about how to make the individual successful, setting them up for success organizationally. And we'll talk about compensation in just a second. And there were a few questions from the audience about that. I guess, first of all, for set up for success organizationally, what do you think is the right organizational structure for a head of sales? Who do they report to?
The founder, CEO.
Got it. Okay. What do you think of, reporting to a COO? Do you think it runs, it does best reporting to CEO versus COO?
Yeah, I think because what you've created is just another layer. If you go to the COO, and I've seen different models can work. And also sometimes models are, forget titling for a moment, they're driven by co-founders, for example, not just one founder. And therefore titles can be a little bit ambiguous.
Yeah.
But if there is a founder or acts as the CEO, then cut out layers wherever possible, particularly in the beginning.
Yeah.
Because you're probably more product driven as a founder, you're going to want that voice of the customer. And you don't want to broker that. Because Chinese whispers definitely alter the information.
Yeah. So what about reporting to the head of sales? There's SEs, AEs, customer success, customer support. What's most effective? I hear this question quite a bit, which is, should customer success report into sales?
We touched on it a little bit in an earlier question. I think when we start the business, because of funding, we might need somebody that sort of oversees everything, because there's one person here, one person there, one person there. I actually think separating customer success from sales at a particular point, let's use a number when we're 5 or 10 million, so we know that what we have is generating revenue. We know that retention rates are X, whatever they might be. We know we've got to focus on those. Our sales leader, we really need to focus on sales and having a maniacal focus on that outcome. Bringing in or promoting a customer success leader, I think, becomes really important as well, and actually should go into the founder or CEO for a period of time. I think there's a time when they come back together, and I mentioned that earlier in terms of scale. But I think if you left an individual in charge as you scaled of all things go to market, you would be weak in certain areas and really strong in others. And that's probably not the outcome you would wish.
Got it. So let's talk about compensation. Let's talk about your philosophy, your experience with base compensation, quotas, setting quotas, MBOs, quantitative MBOs, qualitative MBOs. How do you think about the optimal compensation structure for sales?
Again, I think it's a little bit of an evolution. So there's lots of sources we can go to now where we can do comps and, who pays what and, where we want to be. Are we 75th quartile? Are we 30? Are we 50th? Just how do we want to think about the way we remunerate our company and then our sales force? I'm a huge believer of rewarding success. And by definition, I don't want to reward failure, which are two really obvious things to say. So let me sort of just explain what I mean there. I don't want to pay salespeople anything under 80% performance against their target. I don't want to pay them a cent apart from their base salary.
So there's zero commission if you're under 80%.
If you're under 80%. Now that's a little bit draconian, and I'm a firm believer in that. It doesn't have to be 80, it could be 70. You know, we're starting a company. Can we guarantee we can get our numbers every quarter? No, we can't. And so should it be 60%? But there's got to be a line that says that's failure. And you can use another word. But I'm a big believer in acceleration after 100%, because that's really helping the company. And so when I get to 100%, say it's dollar for dollar from 80% to 100%, and then it's 1.25 or $1.5 to 120%. And it needs to be capped at some time. And the CFO will be very helpful with this, because we can draw the lines where it needs to be capped. But I want to reward success. So I'll give you an example. I had an EMEA vice president sales leader, and I rolled out the comp plan. A great guy, love him, gone on to do tremendous things. And it was the 80% line. So he said to me, you're not going to pay me up until 80%. I said, what line would you like as your failure line? If we're at 80%, we probably don't have a company to worry about. And secondly, you probably won't have your job. I'm being somewhat humorous, but I actually did say that, and I mean it. And I'm a big believer in rewarding success, but making sure we draw a line where it's not a walk in the park for everybody and everybody feels good at 65%.
Yeah, that's a great point. What do you think of MBOs?
Hate them.
Tell me what you really think.
Yeah, absolutely. They have a place. I tell you why I don't like MBOs, and I've observed this, and I've been guilty of this more importantly. So the company's just had a decent quarter. By the way, I think this is a terrible number. It's achieved 92%. So decent quarter. And we've got 40% of the team on MBOs. And amazingly, because we're so busy, MBOs get paid out at 100%. And we've only achieved 92%. And I would say that happens, and I know CEOs well and other executives that tell me, no, it's not done like that in my company. I think that happens in a lot of companies, most companies, in fact, because they're actually hard to manage. I remember a marketing MBO, somebody in DocuSign, when they got 10 appointments for our customer event each year, 10 appointments, they met their MBO. So I'm going to pay them 100% because, and then they came and asked, because they got 12 appointments, could they get 120% of that MBO? Like, get out of here. So I think MBOs have a place if managed correctly and actually can be tracked and actually have a benefit, because I know making appointments is a benefit, but it's not going to change the shape of the company.
Yeah.
So I would try to get rid of as many as I can. And if you start giving salespeople MBOs, maybe in BD you might want to, but I still would want them revenue based. If you start giving salespeople MBOs, it's a slippery slope.
Yeah. Here's a contentious question, perhaps. Should the head of sales get commission?
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%.
What if you weren't the head of sales?
Well,
the counter argument effectively is really what I'm asking about.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. You know, I spent a lot of years in IBM, and I ran, you know, in Asia Pacific. We had engineering, we had finance, even though that was a dotted line. We had HR. We had the business in the software group in IBM, and we had that question in IBM. You know, should the lead executive be on the same comp plan as sales leaders? And I have never heard an argument that would tell me that the executive that runs go-to-market or runs sales shouldn't be on a 50-50 plan, the same as a salesperson. Now, the good news is for founders and CEOs, if you apply the same type of commission structure, you're rarely ever going to get the head of go-to-market into accelerators. And actually, the way you would commission the head of sales would be revenue, would be bookings, would be profitability, would be retention. You maybe split theirs up into 4. You don't want to go crazy and have any more than 4 where there's certain things that are 5%. because that doesn't help anybody. In fact, that never helps anybody in any commission plan. But I've never heard an argument and never really understood why you wouldn't want to pay your go-to-market leader 50-50. Some companies are different, some are 60-40, but I've not actually heard of sales leaders not being paid commission. I'm sure it's out there, and maybe some don't.
Yeah. There's a question, Neil, from the audience. How do you feel about quarterly versus annual commissions?
I think it depends on your business model and what your segments are in your go-to-market. So, for example, if you're in commercial, which is SMB, mid-market, and majors in most companies, that's actually a monthly driven cadence with very strict quarterly targets, but there's strict monthly targets in the first two segments. I think when you get to enterprise, far more quarterly. I do think annual plans are absolutely critical, and you should hold back some of the quarter payments to make sure that the annual target is attained. And so you've got a weighted commission plan. But I think a lot of it depends on the segmentation of the sales model.
So another question here. This is a hot topic, on compensation from founders. How do you think about equity versus cash commission for an early stage SaaS company?
One of the observations that I have is a sales team generally in a hot product company will rely more on commissions to create security than equity. Meaning, a DocuSign as an example, and Taleo, not all of the sales force each year would get our RSUs because you would peanut butter and it wouldn't mean anything. And so if you're with a hot product, and hopefully in accelerators, that's your earning vehicle. I think for any executive, and again, there's studies, and I think we can go onto the internet, one of the most common is if a CEO comes into a company and the founder moves on to executive chairman, they receive 3% of the company in equity. If there's a sales leader that comes on, they receive 0.75 or 1% equity. But I think as you go down the sales chain, commissions is where they make their living, more so than the expectation of equity. Some companies I know are different, but that's how we've operated before at both Taleo and DocuSign, which were both SaaS companies. It actually wasn't that different in IBM, quite frankly. It wasn't. There was only a pool. In fact, in IBM there was a bonus pool, not a commission pool at some segments where you had 100, but actually you needed to give out 200. So it was a really difficult management challenge where you had a bonus pool to actually divide by the worthy, and then making a decision on who the worthy were, bearing in mind you're leaving people out that have achieved. So not the best model in IBM, but the SaaS model, commissions, hot product, that's how salespeople, I think, are remunerated. Yeah.
So there's one final section I want to make sure we touch on, just being mindful of time, and I appreciate all the great questions in the Q&A. And this is about measuring and evaluating your sales leadership, and measuring them for effectiveness. Is it revenue? Is it hiring? Is it marketing? And really what I also want to talk about is, what are the warning signs that, it's just not working with someone? So I guess the first, Neil, is really, how do you measure them? And then the second follow-up is, what are some of the early warning signs that it may not be working?
So the easiest answer to that is, performance. So revenue, bookings, depending on, how you're chartering the sales team. And for me, retention is absolutely critical, and net retention. I think that's a really important measurement. I think when you go a little bit deeper, you want to start looking at the data. And I mentioned some of the things that were important to me, and I think are important generally, around win rates. Is it good business that we're writing? I think that's really important. And I think that's some work with the CFO to answer that question, but it's vital. What is our discounting? Is that sustainable? Because in the beginning, we're trying to get everything we can. And the natural adage is, well, I can beat the competitor, but I need to knock another 50% off. Okay, we need that deal. You know, there's got to be a cutoff point where we don't do those deals anymore. I think preparing ourselves to what is a booking and what is not a booking, I think that's a measurement for a sales leader, because there's got to be a tipping point. In the beginning, we're going to book everything, but as we scale and the business becomes bigger, and maybe we think of an event, then the booking policy has to change. We've got to make sure a sales leader understands that in 18 months, this, and this is going to have to be in place. I think another way we judge a sales leader is the ability to look forward a couple of years when it comes to organization design. Because when you begin, you can afford the org you have. If you can meet your targets on a 2 or 3 year strategic plan, your org is going to look completely different. I want to have that conversation with that sales leader today about what it's going to look like in the future when we meet our objectives. So I think there's a number of, again, slightly non-conventional ways of viewing success and a sales leader. Red flags, again, I come back to it, and this would be understood by everybody. You know, you start missing the number, then let's have a look at why. And we won't have all of the data that tells us, but also let's have a look at the word collaboration. How is that sales leader working across the company? Is it a popular executive? Does he care? How much time does he spend with product? How much time does he spend with engineering? They're really important design factors in terms of the sales leader you have or you want to evolve. Because if it's the single charge, I'm a road warrior, I'm busy, that person probably is not going to be successful. So I think there's a number of ways of looking at red flags and gaining information from the company in a, in a manner that isn't disruptive. And then I would say, we as executives, and I include founders as executives, we generally see ill early, but we act very slowly. And, there's various cliches of, there's a warm body, I need a warm body. That generally isn't going to help. If we followed our intuition and acted in a more expedient way, we would have better results.
Great point. So what about on the remediation, right? Things, a sales leader missed a quarter, missed 2 quarters. Do you attempt to remediate, or 1 strike, 2 strikes are out?
I think with salespeople, and I know that wasn't your question, but I think if you've got a commercial salesperson selling into the mid-market, and I know everybody has different terms, but it's selling into the mid-market, they miss 2 quarters, unless they can show their sales leader or whoever, the founder, a path to achieve Q3 after missing 1 and 2, they're gone. And then they have to achieve that quarter. I think with a sales leader, it shouldn't be that different. I do feel that a sales leader will benefit greatly from having a symbiotic relationship with the founder and actually creating a closeness of trust over time. Because in that way, you can coach, but in that way, there's really no surprises. And so if you're really forecasting correctly and you understand the nuances of why maybe you thought you could do 10 this quarter, but the reality was 10 was never attainable. It was sort of backed in by the CFO, and that was the expenditure, and we wanted to spend 9% on G&A, 50% on sales and marketing, 19% on engineering. If that is backed into those numbers, but when you sat down, you saw, frankly, you could never really do more than that 82%, then there's a good reason to continue the journey with that sales leader.
Yeah.
Because the targets themselves, for whatever reason, unattainable. But it can't be knee-jerk. You've got to put cycles into it to really understand the output and then the outcome.
Yeah. So a question here from the audience, which I'll paraphrase just a little bit. How do you think about early stage companies, limited team, quantity versus quality of outreach and leads? What's more important?
I think quality will always shine through. when I started at DocuSign, we didn't know if we were a feature. I'm sure you had this when you invested. Were we a feature? Were we a solution? Could somebody else build what we had? I mean, at the end of the day, it's just an artifact. There's 134 companies out there that can claim they can, sign something. Look at when you go to Safeway, God forbid, you go on a Verifone and you put Mickey Mouse and you completed your transaction. So we were definitely quantity in the beginning, and you get more refined because you have the tools and you have the technology to help that. In the beginning, it's so not the beginning, because I didn't join in the beginning. We'd already done a lot of hard work. It was just so hard to actually define what was quality and what was quantity. So we sort of worked on the adage, which isn't very scientific, sort of the more the merrier. And as we worked through, we began to understand leads a little bit better. What would lead to a lead being closed? And then you get into things like SQOs and SQLs, and you've got various marketing platforms. So, as we progressed, it became easier. But in the beginning, I didn't know how to define quantity and quality that well. So more is definitely better, but only for a period of time.
Got it. So a number of questions from the audience, which just looking at time, unfortunately, we won't get to, but this one I'm really intrigued with. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What are some unconventional things in sales that you've done that you've seen work?
Absolutely nothing that I can share on this session. Prison cells are not for me. Unconventional. I love that word because we were talking about interviewing, and I like unconventional questions because when you're interviewing candidates, most people always ask the same questions. I categorize that for me in one particular way, and I think that's risks. What risks have I seen work, and what risks have I seen fail? Now, if I'm honest, I've taken a lot of risks, and I'll come on to a couple, and one or two of them I think have worked okay. I've also taken risks where I've fallen flat on my face. I often said in my career, the biggest value I had towards the end of my career is I'd failed enough times to not wish to fail again. And I had the experience to maybe manage through some of that. Hence, I think Taleo and DocuSign, as I became too old to carry myself around, actually benefited from some of those past failures. So one of the risks that I took way back that actually worked, and now it's done by so many, at IBM, we put a inside sales team in 1996 into Dublin, Ireland. And at IBM, we didn't have inside sales. Nobody believed it was a thing. We're direct. We wear, blue suits. We got burgundy ties. We all look the same. We go on 25-legged sales calls. I don't know who had the one leg. But we tried out inside sales, and nobody in IBM wanted to do it. And I was lucky enough. I had a position in IBM, which wasn't Lou Gerstner, but I was able to take a risk, and I got some funding. And it turned out to be, pretty okay. And now, of course, all commercial sales in SaaS, other than the top end of the majors, are inside. That worked out pretty well. At DocuSign, one of the big challenges we had was everybody knew us, and still does, probably to a degree, as a company that enables real estate transactions. And against the board's wishes, I started to verticalize the sales force when we had critical mass. So we started to build, a finance team, an insurance team, which many companies have done. But the way I did it was I wouldn't bring on salespeople unless we basically created a small business unit where I had marketing buy-in, that they could actually fill the pipe, that I could actually make sure I had X amount of salespeople, that product management actually were able to write white papers and support us with use cases. So it was actually a big workout and cost the company a lot of money, and we didn't have that much revenue coming in. But even though it had a shaky start, if you look at the company now, broken down into verticals, that worked very well. And at the time, we were a bit early doing it maybe, but sometimes the earlier the better, even if you have detractors. You know, some of the things that I failed with has been adding an account management layer to a customer success manager, and you end up with the salesman, then you've got maybe the renewal team, then you've got an account manager, then you've got a customer success manager, and it's just too confusing for the customer. You have a lack of ownership, and I've rolled that out before and disbanded it after a couple of quarters. It just didn't work. And that was actually a DocuSign. So anything that was confusing that I've done to the customer or the company, or you had to answer the question, what do they do all day, every day, has generally not worked.
Yeah.
But getting out early and taking some risks with the go-to-market has proved quite fruitful.
Yeah, got it. So I'm just going to do some rapid fire questions here, Neil, just from the audience. How do you think about measuring quality of revenue for early stage companies? So the quality of the logo, the quantum of the ARR, perpetual versus services revenue. How do you measure what quality is early on?
You know, for me, it's either monthly recurring revenue or annual recurring revenue. That's the key metric. I really don't care about services revenue. That's harsh, but as I'm beginning, I want my product to be sticky. I'm willing to invest in that. You know, even as you start to scale services revenue, you'll notice, you know, on some of the investor decks, and you must have seen 1,000 of them, you know, your product is 90% and your services is 10%, and it seems to keep that way. You know, I'd rather outsource services, quite frankly, than build it internally. It's easier said than done, but monthly recurring revenue and ARR absolutely tops it for me. I think when you get under the covers, though, actually looking at the real value of that revenue and the CAC, and actually looking at time to revenue, because one of the challenges with the SaaS model we all know is we can put a lot of effort if it's a sales-led attainment of a customer. We put in a lot of effort to basically get a pilot in place, and we're getting $5,000 a month for all that work. We actually don't see the value, and this is where I think we really need to be thoughtful strategically for a year out, because we've landed, and everybody says land and expand. It's easy to say, but what are those steps to get that $5,000 a month into $50,000 a month in a year's time? And that mapping is absolutely critical. I think that's more important than maybe quantifying value of the different revenue sources or type of revenue, because I paid so much money to get that customer if it's sales-led.
Yeah.
Now, PLG is a little bit different, but actually I've still spent a ton of money in the product to actually activate that opportunity. So I'm interested in that journey to get my value back, because I'm losing money for the first year, no matter what I'm doing with that customer relationship.
Got it. Well, Neil, we're right up on time, and I'm sorry to those that we couldn't get to your questions. This has been invaluable, Neil. The number of questions we've received at registration and now just speaks to just how critical this topic is and how interested the audience is in all of your experience and wisdom. So on behalf of the community, on behalf of Norwest Venture Partners, myself specifically, I can't thank you enough, Neil, for spending the hour with us today. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure, and great to do this. Good to be with you, Dave. And I hope there was one or two takeaways there. Thanks a lot, buddy.
Super. Thank you so much.
God bless.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. This concludes our session.